delighted to be here. This looks like a very interesting space. So it was a good idea to hold it here rather than in the university. Luca, right? You are the person, right? Wonderful. Well, in many ways, if there is one condition that connects a bit what I'm going to talk about cities and migration, it is this image that I have about a massive loss of habitat that Florian alluded to. But really, in my practice, they are two separate domains for research. However, I have now been engaging, also it came out of the Biennale a bit, the German pavilion, actually, which had some quite interesting people, in this notion of, you know, how about occupying abandoned spaces, abandoned villages? I've been tracking a bunch of Spanish techies who, when the crisis comes, lose their jobs, and they decided to go and occupy an abandoned village, truly abandoned for a long time. It took them 2 years, and they produced a new sort of rural economy, but using all kinds of digitized elements. So this is very interesting. Then there is the story, of course, of the schrumpfende Städte in Germany. You know, in what ways could one begin to occupy whatever space there is, whether it's migrants, whether it is, you know, locals, it doesn't matter. But there is a lot of abandoned terrain. There is a lot of land that is not quite dead, that could be brought back to life. There is also a lot of dead land. Now, again, while there is that element that combines both this massive loss of habitat, it is, for me, a bit of a forced marriage to speak both about the cities and about the migrations, because they intersect, but then they really go in different directions as discussion. So bear with me. I'm going to talk mostly about questions urban, and let me say that a critical element that I'm looking at, and it's not easy, is whether a lot of the investment in properties, in urban properties, actually is about the buying of urban land. I've looked a lot in my latest book, Expulsions, about the buying up of rural land, which has displaced millions of people. Massive loss of habitat. The estimate is between 1 million and 3 million each year in the last 4 or 5 years. So, and then you have this massive buying by corporations. I'm looking at the top 100 cities that are recipients of this type of buying in the world. And that is also displacing a lot of people and winding up with sort of semi-empty buildings, towers, etc. So there are these emergent formats, so they affect both the global south and the global north in different ways. Whether they are really connected, I don't know. The outcome has similarities. I just want to emphasize that because I don't want to force the analyses. So now let me check quickly before I keep on talking what time it is, because I have no sense of time. All right, very good. So first let me just put as background this notion of two rising urban formats. And here is, to me, sort of an image that captures this. The corporate buildings, dense, tall, expensive, sometimes beautiful, mostly, I don't know. And then this vast zone that now we call the peri-urban, but really it started in Latin America, la periferia, that which is around the city. When you fly over the periphery in a plane, you think it's all sort of an endless space of just miseries. It isn't, actually. When you go in, there are many formations. There are very interesting things that are happening there. But there is poverty, there is misery, there is also that. So we don't want to romanticize it. All I'm trying to say is that the people who live in these peripheries are struggling to make something. For instance, where in Mexico City, this formation has taken over the ejido, I don't know how much you know, which is collective land ownership, a very old mode that comes from a long time ago. And they try to recreate a notion of the ejido in the periphery. So there is a lot of knowledge transmission from one format to another, and that in itself would be a whole sort of interesting discussion, but we're not going to dwell on that. And if there is no land, you make your shanty town on water, and this is clearly a case in Asia. Or it's right, cheek to cheek. This is a very famous slide by now. I'm sure this is in Venezuela, in Caracas, everybody has seen this. Cheek to cheek, the wealthy and the rich, you know, so it's not even invisible. I think in Europe there is much more a chance that it becomes a bit invisible where the poor live, but when you have such a demand on land, then it actually can become quite visible. And so those people can look from their balconies high there over the space of semi-misery. Now, what I want to focus on now is this notion of buying up urban property and winding up with semi-empty buildings. The buying is done by national capital and by foreign capital. I'm looking at corporate buying, minimum price, $5 million, mostly much higher than that. So we're not talking buying a cute little apartment in the village in Manhattan or in London. This is big buying. Let me put a datum in the air here. Well, two datums. One is a lot of these properties are completely underutilized. So this is different from the past. In the global city, I was already tracking how the Japanese, even the Dutch, they were buying property in London, in the city of London, the financial center, because from that was a platform to access the continent, Europe. Imagine the Dutch, you know, they were, but going via London was an easier way, and they were using those. That was a utility function. Here, a lot of this doesn't have a utility function. So that's datum number one. Datum number two, Singapore, a very well-run government with incredibly smart people in the government, really well-trained people, just bought a big patch of Detroit. Poor, destroyed, Detroit. No announcements, no plans. It's in the public domain for one that because I'm doing research on this, I sort of, I found it, for one reason, and that they had to deal with a public entity, public government, if you want, to buy. So we know that it happened. Now, Detroit is a space of misery. Gradually, people have been leaving. They're just waiting out their time. I have a fly that has sort of fallen in love with me. So if you see, it's not that I'm crazy, huh? It's the fly. So my question then is, what's next there in Detroit? Well, what's next, it seems to me, is the building up of a corporate center eventually. Singapore is not going to be the only one buying land in Detroit. Detroit is a very poor city, but it is in one of the richest, best organized regions of the United States. So this notion of buying without an immediate utility function is something that runs through this data set that I want to share with you. So here are the top, I'm just giving you, clearly there is no room here for 100, but I'm just giving you here the top, okay, no, wait, that jumped. Okay, this is the top 10 of the top 100 cities. This is just 1 year. This is a story that really starts after the crisis of 2008, but it doesn't really take off until just a few years ago. So this is mid-2013 to mid-2014. This is just buying of property, not site development. Now, this is language that you all understand, right? When I speak to social scientists, they don't know quite what site development is, but you do, right? Yeah, okay, right. So nothing to do. They're just buying property. Site development is also happening, but I'm just looking at this because it's that utility function that is absent, that intrigues me. Now, the minimum property, as I said, value is 5 million. So we're not talking little thingies. So as you can see, it's sort of a mix of places. And here is a larger distribution, and you can see that it sort of winds up, then the next, till the full 100, they're more or less at that level. The concentration is very much at the top, but when you take the whole volume, it is much bigger than just the ones that are at the top. So for this particular mid-2013 to mid-2014, over $600 billion. Huh? Again, minimum price sort of $5 million. That's using New York as a standard. And now, this is foreign investment. As you can see there, London is number one. I don't know if that is something to be proud about or not in this case, to be number one in that. But again, look at, for instance, if you look at the growth rates, look at Amsterdam. Can people see? I think this is blocking. So Amsterdam from one year to the next at 248%. I happened to be in Amsterdam when a big foreign company bought 12 grachthuizen, you know, these beautiful, and I mentioned this. People were not aware of it. This was like a year and a half ago. And they were just in shock. They couldn't believe that that had happened. Well, look at the growth rate, 248%. It's higher than what is in London or in New York, partly because they have been at it for a while. By the way, am I speaking too fast in English? Or I have a foreign accent in English, so people tell me that they can understand me better than the mumbling Brits. I hope that holds here. Now, and then here you have, again, this distribution, you know, which even more concentration at the top. Now, I want to go back to, let me just go back. I'm having trouble seeing here. Let me go back to this slide. So there is a kind of debate or discussion going on about the foreign investment. And one thing that comes out of that is the easy use. By easy, I mean something slightly negative, huh? The easy use of the notion of gentrification. So many people say, well, what's new? That's gentrification. Well, I don't know. You know, I am always inclined to go digging and say, rather than taking the self-evident. Moreover, if you consider that, for instance, the Qatari royals, you know, Qatar, Doha, good airline, etc., they now own more of central London than the Queen of England. I don't care about either one of them. Frankly, I don't bother. You know, I'm not worried. But that is beyond gentrification. That is something else. So this is a continuous battlefield for me, is the trotting in. I'm sure you have that a bit in architecture as well. The trotting in of the familiar category that explains a lot. Every now and then, we must interpolate the familiar category. That works very well most of the time, but at times does not work. So for me, there is something else happening here. Now, I sort of ask myself, what does this all look like? This question comes from an engagement that I had, very serious engagement in my expulsions book, with the material. The material supposedly tells you a truth. It may be partial, but it tells you something. And I'm finding in the research that I'm doing that actually the material sometimes doesn't tell you anything. Now, I don't know, you as architects, you deal continuously with the material, but in the social sciences, there is a bit of a notion that if it's material, there's a kind of embedded truth in that. There's only so much misrepresenting that can happen. So I want to share with you a little story. You reminded me when you mentioned the Zeit. I was asked to, by Jungklausen, I don't know, some of you may know him, the German, to sort of walk with him. We did for 2 hours on a very cold day in this central area of London, here. You know, and sort of, I was meant to be sort of rambling and talking aloud about what we were seeing. Now, here are a set of buildings that are, some are landmarked. This is the heart of London, really. These are very significant buildings. They are all owned by one foreign company. But you don't see that. And in fact, the tourists, I never go walking there, but I was sort of interested in hearing what the tourists, because it's also a lot of tourists go there. And the tourists were all sort of saying, basically, look at these beautiful British buildings. No, ladies and gentlemen, they are not Chinese. One Chinese company bought all of them. Now, you know, now, again, I am not at all worried about the notion that a Chinese company came and bought them all. You know, I'm just intrigued by what we, in this case, by what we do not see, by the way in which the material tells us a rather partial story. And they, of course, look totally British and etc. You know, and to me, this is the social scientist in me. For me, this is a very engaging issue. Now, I just want, as a footnote, just so that you're all, you know, informed, the Chinese have invested all over. Look at this. They're everywhere. And the bigger the circle, the more the money, huh? So you can see that buying those buildings in London, it's also a Chinese company that bought the Grachthuizen in Amsterdam. You know, it's just, this is part of the, and they're just one, because there are many nationalities involved in doing this buying. Now, I cannot help but use this case to illustrate another point. And that is a question of density. And basically my proposition is that today, in these kinds of cities, you cannot assume that if it's dense, it is a city. In other words, when you were walking in the hills of Italy, you know, centuries ago, if you saw a dense built-up something, you knew that was a town. Today, I think that density is no longer working as that indicator that it has worked like that for a very long time. So you can have a lot of density. Think of a mega project that is privately controlled, that has taken over urban tissue, little streets, etc., etc. Think of massive sort of corporate, like this, 14 of these corporate towers are being built in this one patch of land in New York City. You know, we have to interrogate density. A lot of density, actually, I would argue, de-urbanizes, rather than being an instance or an indicator of the urban. Now, this is an interesting story. This is Atlantic Yards. This is not Hudson Yards. Most people have heard of Hudson Yards, if you're architects, but not of Atlantic Yards. This was a region, an area in New York City where you had artists who had been priced out of the Manhattan spaces. You have sort of a kind of manufacturing that I call urban manufacturing, which is a manufacturing that produces for certain sectors rather than for services like museums and the Museum of Natural History, for instance, the opera, the fancy designers, you know. So it's a very live part and sort of a bit invisible, but it's a very live part of the current sort of city. So it inverts the historic relationship between manufacturing and services. It used to be that the services were servicing manufacturing. This is a manufacturing that services service sector. So to me, very interesting. And then finally, you had sort of low-income people. It was a deeply urban. It's a huge patch of land, by the way. It was a deeply urban condition. Well, one company, again, has thrown everything out of there and is building 14 of these towers. So the density is going to rise enormously. Beauty is another matter, but let's just focus on density for now, right? So but it actually will de-urbanize that space. You understand what I'm saying, right? So this question of density, a certain type of density can actually be anti-urban, which until about 30 years ago, I would say, if you had density, you had an urban situation, so to speak. Mostly. Now, just into the details here, this is really funny. So this is also a Chinese company. I'm sorry, I showed you the map because the Chinese are everywhere and it's highly visible. They're being tracked by all kinds of people, so it's just easy cases, but they also happen to be significant. So they decided that Atlantic Yards was not quite an elegant name. Now, in English, yard signals an industrial setup. So they decided, but this was not clear to them, evidently, so they decided to change it to Pacific Yards. Now, the Pacific Ocean is very far away from New York. Plus, they kept the yards, you know, precisely. Anyhow, they have now understood there was enough commentary in New York that they are going to change again. But anyhow, yeah, right. I cannot see anything. So now here just a very quick wrap up. The top 100 cities by property investment that I just showed, that excludes the Atlantic Yards bit. That is a different story. 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, and an absolutely grotesque 76% of property investment. Again, that is not site development, that is just buying into property. Now, I don't know how you are about zeros, but this is the worldwide real estate assets are nearly 60% of the value of all global assets. I must say, when you say assets, you have repositioned whatever the materiality of the building into a financial zone. So it doesn't include all buildings. Some buildings are just being bought and sold, in some very traditional circuit. Asset already means that you have financialized a bit. That's very important. Now look at that. That's a lot of zeros. So we're talking $217 trillion. That is as much as global GDP. But finance, as measured by the standard measure, which is outstanding derivatives, it's just a footnote. You don't have to understand this to understand what I'm talking about, but just over a quadrillion. That's 3 more zeros. That's a hell of a lot of zeros. So finance has a way of producing value. Now, let me just give you a little footnote. I'm going to return to it. I see finance is very different from traditional banking. We all need the traditional bank. So finance actually is an extractive sector. That's my definition. I love that definition. It's like mining. It goes, develops instruments, the mine develops tools and iron machinery, extracts, and then it moves on. The traditional bank needs generations to keep on making loans. It wants the middle classes to thrive and the sons and daughters to do better. You understand the difference, huh? So the traditional bank is a reasonable proposition. Finance is not really. It's one of my big subjects, and I don't want to. I'm always at risk of falling into that. Now, I just want to give you some images that are sort of, really neither here nor there. But anyhow, this is London property purchased by overseas companies between 2005 and 2014. So you can see that there is a lot of that. Huh? As you saw, London is number 1 when it comes to foreign investors. Now, Manhattan has a slightly different story. It's a more recent story, and here is I just show you very quickly. This is in itself not particularly interesting. It's just a bit shocking, I would say. In 2014, 50% of sales over 5 million in Manhattan were to shell companies. Do people know what shell companies are? They are invented companies to hide a real buyer. Manhattan is rampant with Shell here and Shell there. It has nothing to do with the oil company. It's just Shell companies. So the Warner, here now I show you 3 images of 3 grand new buildings, very luxury, blah, blah. So the Time Warner Center in New York City, 122 of the 192 condos are owned by people who used shell companies that hid their identities. You're with me, right? You follow what I'm saying? So it's sort of unpleasant. And they're mostly empty, by the way. I mean, you have partly, occupied, and the rest, the dark part, is what is not occupied. And you have people literally commenting, saying, I'm so alone in that building. Because the rest, it's just stored. That is why I'm saying it's storing money. The utility function is very, very low when it comes to actual use. Now, here's the Bloomberg Tower, very famous. 57% of condos are owned by shell companies. I don't know if you understand the meaning of shell companies. This is shocking. It's disgusting. It shouldn't be happening. At the same time, you have all kinds of people who cannot afford housing. You understand this juxtaposition. So you have more and more buildings that are emptier and emptier, and more people, the firemen, the nurses, the teachers, the policemen, they cannot afford to live in the city. Same thing is happening in London. Well, it wouldn't be happening here, but maybe in some European cities. And guess what? The governments have to subsidize the firemen, the policemen, the nurses, and the teachers, because they need for them to live in the city. Guess where the subsidies come from? From the average citizen, but not those shell companies. Huh? You understand? This is a grotesque distortion. Maybe it's not all clear, but and here's another one. 69% of condos in the plaza are owned by shell companies. economies. Now, I want to switch, radical switch, total, etc., to the migration question. And then I'm coming back to this urban stuff. So this is partly because I would say, Florian, that you put a little pressure on me to somehow, bring it in. At first I thought I was going to talk about migration. And then he said, no, but they're all architects. So I said, okay, well then, etc. You get the picture. So if this is sort of think of it as exciting new art. You know what I mean? That you juxtapose stuff that really doesn't go together too well. I mean, behind it all lies this massive loss of habitat, which we see vis-a-vis cities. London and New York are famous, but so are others, Paris, etc. You know, the big European cities all have middle classes who can no longer afford to live in there. So there is a loss of habitat, though, but it's very different from the migrants. So with the migration story, I'm looking at migration events that are a bit less in the news than what is happening in Europe, though I've also looked at the European question. I just want to come back to this notion of a loss of habitat to explain some of these migrations. This is the persecution of the Rohingya. The Rohingya are a very old Muslim sort of, sect or whatever you call it, who has lived in Myanmar for centuries. There were never problems. Myanmar opens up to the world, the last 3 or 4 years. You have vast entry of investors that are buying up land, buying up this. I mean, it's horrible what's happening. And a lot of people are getting displaced, hundreds of thousands of, Myanmari. In that context, a distortion happens. And this is a distortion that recurs. That is why I'm emphasizing it. So here is a distortion. A sect, this is absolutely shocking. One particular sect of Buddhist monks, so it's not sex, okay? Buddhist monks has declared that it is that the Buddha, whatever, wants the priests, the monks, to kill Rohingya. You understand how far-fetched that is, right? In terms of the Buddhist faith. That's an absolutely horrendous distortion. So most of the discussion then among the experts of this kind of migration that has happened there is about these crazy monks. I find that an unsatisfactory explanation. So I want to say, well, why these monks? And the focus is all on the monks and these crazy monks, and how can they be that? They're Buddhists. How can they say, go kill Rohingya? No. There is a much larger story in the making which has to do with the loss of habitat. You have investors from all, and governments also, from all kinds of other countries entering Myanmar to capture whatever the wealth. They are displacing hundreds of thousands of Myanmari. But the narrative that emerges is not against the government because that could be a threat. It's against the Rohingya. Here is something that is different. They're Muslims. I don't know if you're with me. Do you understand? So I see there is a kind of parallel here between what's happening in cities where people, the middle classes and the modest working class, the modest middle classes and the working classes are losing, access to housing in the way they used to have it in the past, while the buildings are sitting empty, with this kind of story. This is a story that repeats itself in Africa, etc., with other contents and other modalities. So the category that I am developing to understand the current migrations is I argue that a third subject has emerged, a subject for which we do not have a term and we do not have law that recognizes it. Right now we have two subjects. The immigrant has long existed. It's national law recognizes the immigrant. The immigrant is a strong subject. She leaves behind a home that she wants to support, etc., etc. And we have the refugee, a regime that comes out of World War II, as you well know, that, is also, it's international law. So we have two traditional subjects, Both of them, by the way, need to be revised because things have really changed. The refugee regime, the UNHCR, comes out of a type of war that is very different from current war, which is asymmetric war, which tends to urbanize war. Irregular combatant meets conventional army, that tends to urbanize war. This is something well established. I should say I finished a huge project where we were in Kabul, in Karachi, in Baghdad, in Ciudad Juarez, places like that, looking at this issue of asymmetric war. It's really a transformation. The irregular combatant, as some of you probably know, gains advantage from making the city the operational space. The conventional army gains from having open skies to drop bombs, etc. It's just totally different. Tanks, open spaces. So this is now has led, for instance, the United States government actually trains its soldiers now in asymmetric combat. In other words, they have to enter the urban tissue. Anyhow, footnote, apart, etc. So I hope you're still with me. I'm jumping. You're all smart, right? So we don't have to bring in all the... So here are just a few more figures. Rohingya and Bangladeshi are also hanging in there. These are the... And then what I really wanted to show, this is a whole other theater, but it functioned a bit like the Mediterranean here in Europe, in the sense that you had these ships overloaded with refugees, mostly these Rohingya and Bangladeshi, just floating in the ocean, slowly dying, thousands and thousands and thousands, 150,000, just in like two years or something. So, and invisible, everybody was focused on the Mediterranean, which certainly was a far more dramatic and much bigger event. But this was actually quite serious stuff. The Andaman Sea was the equivalent of the Mediterranean. And none of the countries wanted to deal with them. And literally the images that you have of these floating ships overloaded with people, it was like what was happening in the Mediterranean. And here you have sort of also the trafficking routes, because of course the traffickers are in here as well. This is you see there is the Andaman Sea. So this is a whole other mix of conditions, but in the end there is something that is a parallel, if you want, to what happened in Europe. The other migration that I'm looking at, and it's the same story of loss of habitat, is unaccompanied, undocumented children. The youngest that we know about is 8 years old, who come from Central America. This is not Mexico, Central America. They come from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador. They come from the capitals of those three countries. Those three cities, along with Yemen, are the most violent places in the world, according to whatever those general measures that are used. Now, here you see the increase. Those are those three countries, and you can see 2010, 2011, wow, it comes. The figures that we have often come from the United States. We don't know how many die. So here's the question. Why? Why is this happening? So the direct answer, what the children will also say, is violence. I'm afraid. It's as simple as that. They say, I'm afraid. And so the analysis then has proceeded as follows. Those people are so violent, they're just killing. No, I ask myself, wait a minute, why? Why now this type of violence? Well, guess what? Loss of habitat. The United States has managed to destroy more and more land via its sort of plantation agriculture. There is a lot of new land grabbing that is happening because we are growing everything there. So again, we have a deeper set of conditions. And you have, of course, climate change. In all of these situations, climate change is also playing a role. So I say there are these emergent histories that are coming out of a whole variety of conditions that, however, recur in very different parts of the world. And again, just as a footnote, I said it earlier, these kinds of flows that I'm looking at should not be simply seen as migrations, the regular migration story. They are a different kind of flow. They are a flow that comes out of this period, and they do not exist in law. We don't have a regime that recognizes them. Because recognizing them means what? dealing with the big multinational corporations, dealing with the governments, dealing with the fact that the mining companies never clean up after themselves. So when you bring in the question of loss of habitat in all these rural areas, you begin to have an explanation, rather than just looking at the people themselves, saying, oh, they are violent, they are afraid. No, no, no. There is a larger story in the making. So one of the efforts for me is, besides the fact that I think we should revise the UNHCR, the refugee regime, and besides which I'm not the only one, a lot of people are saying this, and the fact that the migration laws are a bit arbitrary, etc., they should also be updated. There is this third subject, which for me is very much a subject of our epoch, of the Anthropocene, is one way of putting it, but I really think it's not just climate, the question of climate change. By the way, climate change, far too pretty as language. Do you know what I'm saying? Climate change, I mean, it sounds so pretty. If you're innocent, you think, oh, wow. So in my expulsions book, the chapter that really got me going, I called it, by the way, no commas, no nothing, dead land, dead water, because that's what we're talking about. Huh? So this question of language is forever, for me, a serious engagement, I must say. It's probably because I'm a foreigner. I grew up in 6 languages, and I don't speak a single one perfectly. You know what that is for an academic? It's not so great. So anyhow, there is a kind of parallel, but we really don't want to push it too much, between the fact of all these empty, fancy buildings, all that buying up of urban property in our big cities that is sort of expelling and making it impossible. And this is a well-known story by now. I don't know about Europe, rich Europe, you know, but in many parts of the world. And this other way. And so this massive loss of habitat, for me, due to climate change, but also due to how we have organized our economies, is to me sort of a critical connector. But I repeat, I usually do not mix the two subjects because it doesn't help. But you are so smart that I thought I could do it. But anyhow, you will tell me afterwards over plenty of wine whether it was a mistake. Now, I'm back now to the urban situation. So I'm keeping on this path of understanding this, the way in which the supply of housing is, and of buildings, if you want, is undergoing distortions. Somebody has to tell me how much longer I can speak, because yeah, no, don't say, because I can really talk long. I grew up in Latin America, so we can talk for 2 hours. I'm not going to do that, don't worry. I am dying for a glass of wine. I just came in from China, so I'm sort of, you know, really up for. So anyhow, so the other thing that has happened, and this to me is very interesting also, is the inventing of a certain type of housing market. And it is basically a matching market. If anybody follows the economists that get Nobel Prizes, the one got it about 4 years ago for matching markets. So let me give you a simple example. When a university, I'm sure that this university also wants to hire people from other universities to staff a department, their hospital, whatever it might be, they don't just go to any place. You know, they have particular other institutions that they say, I can work with that. So off from that model, which is a fairly well-established model in many sectors, comes this kind of market. Now here is the story. So this is a market, and I worked with the Financial Times on this. This is the Financial Times produced an amazing set of stories. So these are minimum prices, all right? Now, by now those prices, this came out about 2 years ago. By now those prices are much higher, but they are minimum prices. That keeps out all kinds of potential buyers. And of course the prices actually are more like, they're extraordinarily high. The actual value of those properties is much lower than 100 million, you know. Now, look at the nationalities that you see are most of the nationalities involved. The percentages that you see on this column is how much those listed nationalities represent of all the buyers. So in the case of New York City, all those nationalities are really only 50%. In the case of Monaco, it's 100%. I was amazed at that, by the way. I wonder whether they forgot a few people in there. But anyhow, you see Paris, London, Dubai, New York. Oopsie, I have something missing. So the slide doesn't show. Ooh, no, it doesn't. Okay, so you have Shanghai. Can people see Shanghai? It looks like the world wants to buy in Shanghai. The one that comes after that, which isn't showing, is Hong Kong. And the main buyers in Hong Kong, they account for a very large share, are mainland Chinese. Do you understand the irony? So Shanghai, everybody and your grandmother wants to buy. And in Hong Kong, the main buyers are mainland Chinese. You know. And then there is Dubai, by the way, I want to point out, you see that the nationalities are quite different. Dubai represents a nexus. We tend to think of Dubai as pure glitz, but it is interesting that it captures the elites of Africa to a point that none of the others do. Now, a lot of these places that are bought are empty. And when I say empty in a city, it means that it eliminates part of the supply. And so a Guardian photographer managed to get in. Now, you know, you can tell that somebody has not lived here in a very long time. And look, how long does it take to get that much moss, or moth, whatever you pronounce it. You know what I'm saying. So I was very interested when I was doing this research to check it out. So I sort of made a mistake. I said, okay, I'm going to walk a dog. Now, I don't have a dog. Because walking a dog means the dog stops, you know. So I wanted to go there. It's a big avenue, Bishop Avenue, that is sort of where you have a lot of foreign buyers, etc. And there are sort of mansions. And so I was struggling with this dog, etc. And nobody on the street. And then finally, a very elegant older lady who lived in one of these, but British. She was British. She was not foreign. And she's also walking a dog. I had a crisis then with a dog. I didn't know how to handle. She had a huge dog. I had a little dog. It was a problem. But anyhow, but it gave me a chance to sort of talk. And then at one point she says, "It's so empty here. It's so empty." And I sort of like that, you know, because think of Beverly Hills, you know, LA, Los Angeles. They want to see nobody. You know, that's the fancy American version of being fancy. The Brits, no matter how rich they are, they sort of like people much more. The Americans are quite peculiar. But anyhow, so I used my little dog, the dog of a friend, to spend time, you know, and not evoke suspicion. Now, one question that one can ask is all this stuff about cities that I've shown you, why does it matter? And it seems to me that the city, when the chips are down, when I want to find one core element, one can, of course, mention many, but a core element that in the end really matters to me, it's that the city is one of the few spaces today where those without power get to make a history, an economy, a culture. And think of any big city. Now, I usually think of London and New York because I know them well. I don't know how it works here, but I think it would probably be different. A lot of the very powerful firms that were in London 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, same thing for New York, dead, finished, gone. A lot of the powerful governing entities, systems, closed systems, gone. But urban space, the city, and the neighborhoods, and I think of the neighborhoods as spaces that are modest spaces, where modest people live, they're there. So there is something about urban space, and that is why I think of it as complex but incomplete, and in that openness, that mixture of complexity and being incomplete, lies the capacity of urban space to outlive far more powerful systems that are closed. I mean, to me, it's very dramatic in New York. Most of the big, powerful firms, they don't exist anymore. And there is the city, you know. And so that is why it sort of hurts to see how this urban space is getting misused, if you want. Now, I just as a footnote, I like to say this, you know, the city is a complex but incomplete system, which really means that you have removed yourself from the city to such a point, because complex and incomplete could be many things, right? That you have to rediscover what is the city. Yeah? So when you begin to look at it that way, and the fact that really those without power, the neighborhoods, they have been able to make cultures, to make histories, etc., etc. Now they keep changing, but it is to me really interesting that those spaces still exist. Today, we're rapidly destroying them through a mechanism that is totally transversal rather than endogenous to the city. It's an outside element that comes and kills, if you want. Now, the other thing that I think is important is that the city has a capacity to make us all into urban subjects. Most of the time, we are not urban subjects. We're very specific types of subjects. But there are moments of the day when we become urban subjects. And to me, that is fascinating. No matter class, no matter religion, think of rush hour traffic. We're all, the rush hour time, I mean, we're all trying to get the train. It's a total mix of people. It's never total, but you know what I mean, it's quite. And so those are moments when the city can actually hack, and I mean hack in the original meaning, unsettling the original design of something. That is the origin of hacking. You know about hacking. Now today it's often thought of as being criminal. No, but in its origins, hacking was a very interesting activity connected, to digital, etc. So when the city can hack all the other more specific subjects, we also are. And so I think of rush hour traffic. This is King's Cross, it's just an amazing moment of the day. Now I think I'm finished here. So let me just very quickly recap one element, which is that both inside of our cities, our big cities, towns are a different story, all right, or mid-sized cities, also probably a different story, but our big cities, which have these peculiar capabilities, more so than a small provincial town where the hierarchy might be very strong. This notion of what I've described to you does constitute a loss of habitat, and then at the same time, the migrants, another loss of habitat. They're simply being thrown out. What I didn't clarify enough probably was that a lot of the land grabs that are happening in the global south, the development of mines, also the question of flooding, climate change, flooding, dead land, etc., all of that is generating a massive displacement of people from their living space. So we are confronting a situation where, in principle, our cities, which have the capacity of, holding a lot of people and still functioning, they have shown us that. Our cities are being distorted through some of the extreme conditions that I have shown you. I have shown you especially the top cities where it's very extreme, but there are those 100 cities where this kind of stuff is happening. So in some ways, there is something that we need to confront, and we need to have a fairly clear understanding as to why it matters. So I gave you my understanding, but it could be other kinds of understanding as well, clearly. It's just that I just shared this with you. So, well, I'm done. So maybe you have some questions. Thank you very much.